One of the reasons I fell in love with fantasy stories in the first place, and one of the reasons I started writing fantasy myself, is magic systems. Not because they're the most important part of the story, they're not, but because they're easily the most fun. And what's funny is that gacha games, of all things, actually put a ridiculous amount of effort into creating magic systems. Complex rules, factions, power sources, metaphysics, sometimes more thought than entire fantasy novels ever get. And yet, most of the time, those systems never really get to matter beyond combat or lore entries. So this video, and honestly this whole little series I want to start, isn't about pointing fingers or calling that bad writing. It's about curiosity, about looking at these systems and asking, what if they mattered more? What if they were allowed to shape characters, choices, and stories, not just animations and damage numbers? This is gonna be a bit lighter, less breakdown, more let's talk about cool ideas, because as someone who loves writing magic systems, I don't see missed potential here. I see a playground that's barely being used. So let's start with the basics. What magic systems actually do in stories, and why gacha games keep creating great ones even when they don't fully take advantage of them. Before we talk about gacha specifically, we need to clear up one thing, because when people talk about magic system, they often mean completely different things. At the simplest level, a magic system is just a set of rules that defines how magic works in a story. What can it do, what can't it do, where does it come from, and what happens when someone pushes it too far. But broadly speaking, most fantasy magic falls somewhere between two ends of a spectrum. Soft magic systems, those are the mysterious ones. They don't explain everything, they don't spell out the rules, and they don't really want you to think too hard about how they work. Magic in these stories exists to create wonder, fear, or a sense of the unknown. It's less about problem solving and more about atmosphere. Think of magic that feels ancient, unknowable, or godlike. You're not meant to calculate it, you're meant to feel it. Soft magic works best when magic is rare, magic is dangerous, or magic represents something bigger than the character themselves. Now for hard magic systems, those systems are the opposite. These are the systems that love rules. They explain where power comes from, how it's used, what it costs, and what its limits are. If a character solves a problem with magic, you're usually able to trace why that solution worked. Hard magic turns magic into a tool, sometimes even into science. These systems shine when magic is common, magic is used in combat or strategy, or characters are expected to solve problems creatively using defined rules. And here's the important part, hard magic systems don't kill creativity, they enable it. Most stories aren't one or the other. Almost no story is purely soft or purely hard. Most live somewhere in the middle. You might have a hard system for combat, but soft unexplained elements for gods, anomalies, or cosmic forces. And that middle ground is where gacha games almost always sit. Which is interesting, because gacha games love building complex rule-heavy magic systems, but they don't always let those systems do much narrative work. There's a quote Brandon Sanderson uses in one of his lectures that I've always liked. He describes storytelling as plot, characters, and setting glued together by conflict. And in that framework, magic systems sit very clearly on the world building side of things. They're not plot, they're not characters, they're not conflict by themselves. Which is why, technically speaking, world building is often described as the least important part of that trio when it comes to whatever a story actually works. And yeah, that's true. You can absolutely tell a great story with minimal world building. You can tell a great story with barely explained magic. You can even tell a great fantasy story where magic barely shows up at all. But here's where I slightly diverge, especially when we're talking about fantasy and science fiction. Because people don't come to these genres just for tight plotting or strong character arcs. They come because they want to experience a world that doesn't exist. They want to see something strange, impossible, or unfamiliar unfold in front of them. And that experience doesn't happen in a vacuum. In fantasy or science fiction, magic systems aren't just background texture, they're part of what makes the world feel different from ours. They define what's possible, what's dangerous, and what's normal. So while magic systems might not be the thing that makes a story function, they play a huge role in what makes it interesting, engaging, and frankly, fun. And that distinction matters, because when a magic system exists only as a lore document, or only as a combat mechanic, it still does world building, but it rarely does storytelling. The moment magic starts affecting how people live, how they think, what choices are even available to them, that's when it stops being a system and starts becoming part of the story itself. And this is where gacha games get really interesting, and also where they often stop short. because they build incredibly detailed worlds and power systems, but they don't always let those systems participate in the narrative. Which brings us to the real question. If magic systems aren't the most important part of the storytelling, why do they feel like such a missed opportunity when they're underused? That's what I want to dig into next. Here's the interesting contradiction with gacha games. From a gameplay perspective, gacha magic systems are almost always hard systems. They have to be. When a game asks you to build a team of characters whose abilities interact, stack, trigger, or amplify each other, you need clear rules, cooldowns, conditions, resource costs, synergies, limits. Otherwise, the entire combat system falls apart. So mechanically, these games are built on extremely rigid, well-defined systems. The rules are clear, the boundaries are strict, the logic is consistent, but then something strange happens when you move from gameplay to narrative. Those same systems, the ones with exact rules and interactions, suddenly became vague. They are treated less like structured systems and more like background flavor. In the story, magic often stops being something characters think through and starts being something they just have. Abilities work when the plot needs them to. Limitations appear only when they're convenient. Rules that matter deeply in gameplay barely exist in dialogue or problem solving. And the result is that weird split where the player understands the magic system better than the characters living in that world. That's the part that always disappoints me a little. Because when magic systems are used only for combat, they're doing the bare minimum. They're functional, but they're not expressive. You rarely see characters actively reasoning through the rules of their powers, experimenting with limitations, solving narrative problems by understanding how the system actually works. Not because they can't, but because the story rarely asks them to. And to be clear, this isn't a technical limitation, it's a prioritization issue. Gacha games are designed around gameplay first, monetization second, and narrative support somewhere after that. So magic systems are optimized to be fun to play, not necessarily meaningful to live with. But that's exactly why it feels like such a missed opportunity, because these systems are already interesting. They're already defined, they already have internal logic. Letting them participate more actively in the narrative wouldn't complicate the story, it would enrich it. Even small moments, characters arguing about what should or shouldn't be possible, tensions created by hard limits instead of vague danger, creative problem solving based on known rules, would instantly give the world more texture and credibility. Instead, most gacha stories treat magic narratively as a soft system, mysterious, flexible, and mostly unexplored, even though the game itself proves that it doesn't have to be. And that disconnect is where a lot of potential quietly goes to waste. This is where magic systems stop being lore and start becoming story. Because the moment a system has clear rules, it can do something incredibly useful for a narrative. It can generate conflict on its own. Not big flashy end of the world conflict, but the good kind. The kind that comes from limits, trade-offs, and choices. When characters understand how their power works, every problem stops being a vague obstacle and starts becoming a question. What can we actually do here, and what are we willing to give up to do it? That's when rules become stakes. A hard system doesn't make things less interesting, it does the opposite. It narrows the field, it removes easy answers, it forces creativity. If a character knows what their power costs, what it can't do, what happens if they push it too far, then every decision carries weight before anyone even throws a punch, and that's the part gacha stories rarely lean into. Because in a lot of gacha narratives, magic exists as a solution, not as a problem. It shows up to end fights, resolve arcs, or justify spectacle, and then quietly steps out of the way. But when rules are treated seriously, magic stops being a button and starts becoming a constraint. And constraints are where storytelling thrives. Limits force characters to argue, hesitate, compromise, make mistakes. They turn power into responsibility instead of a convenience. You don't need long explanations or technical breakdowns for this to work. Even small moments do a lot of heavy lifting. A character refusing to use an ability because they know the costs. A plan failing because someone misunderstood the rule. Tension coming not from can we win, but can we afford to win like this? That's narrative momentum created by the system itself. And what makes it especially frustrating and exciting in gacha games is that the foundation is already there. The rules already exist, the systems are already defined, the limits are already part of gameplay. The story just rarely lets them matter outside of combat. When magic systems are allowed to guide conflict instead of just decorating it, the world feels more grounded. choices feel more deliberate, and characters start to feel like people navigating a system, not avatars waiting for cutscenes to happen. And that's when magic stops being just world building, that's when it becomes storytelling. So if integrating magic systems more deeply into the narrative can make stories more engaging, more grounded and more interesting, why don't gacha games do it? Letting a magic system matter narratively doesn't just add flavor, it changes structure. Once rules start shaping conflict, the story can't move the same way anymore. Problems can't be resolved arbitrarily. Solutions have to respect limitations. Character choices become constrained by what's actually possible, not just what the plot wants next. That makes storytelling more interesting, because it also makes it harder to control. Conflicts would become designed differently. Conflicts would have to be designed differently. Story arcs would need to account for how magic can and can't be used to navigate them. You'd need consistency not just across one chapter, but across months or years of updates. In other words, the moment magic system starts doing narrative work, they stop being optional. And that's a big ask for a format that's already struggles to maintain coherence. Most gacha narratives are juggling long-term serialization, frequent character introductions, rotating focus, monetization pressure, uneven writing teams, constant content deadlines. Adding another system that actively shapes conflict makes that balancing act more fragile. But here's the important part. That's not an excuse. As writers, complexity isn't something we avoid, it's something we manage. If a story already has rules, already has structure, already has internal logic, then choosing not to use it narratively isn't simplification, it's omission. And this is why the argument it would be too complicated doesn't really hold up. If a game had committed to a soft magic system from the beginning, that would be one thing. Ambiguity would be baked into the DNA of the story. But most gacha games don't do that. They already have hard systems, they already define limits, they already teach players how those rules work. They just don't let the story engage with them. And when you look at the scale of those projects, the budgets, the teams, the resources, it's hard to argue that capability is the issue. The more likely reason is simpler. It isn't the priority. Gameplay has to work, content has to ship, the story has to be good enough to support the rest. Letting magic systems shape narrative would require a different kind of commitment, one where story isn't just support, but a pillar. And that's why it feels like such a letdown, because the potential is already there, the systems are already built, the opportunity is obvious. It's not that gacha games can do this, it's that most of them choose not to. So at the end of all this, I don't think the takeaway is that gacha games are doing magic systems wrong. It's that they're leaving a lot on the table. These games already build detailed, rule-driven systems. They already teach players how those systems work. They already rely on them for moment-to-moment engagement. The gap isn't capability, it's intention. When magic systems stay locked to gameplay, they function. When they're allowed to shape choices, limitations, and consequences, they tell stories. And that's the space I'm interested in exploring with this series, not to nitpick every system, not to rank them, but to look at how they could be used and sometimes almost are as real narrative tools. I don't know when the next video in this series will be out. Part of the problem is that gacha magic systems are honestly kind of a mess. They're layered, inconsistent, often half-explained, and sometimes contradict themselves depending on whatever you're looking at, the gameplay, lore, or story cutscenes. So it takes time to entangle them enough to talk about them meaningfully. But I do know what the next one will be about. It's going to be Star Rail's magic system. Not because it's popular or because it's an easy example, but because in its early days, Star Rail's magic system actually inspired me as a writer, very loosely but meaningfully. It played a role in shaping the system I'm using in the story I'm currently writing, The Gatekeeper. And revisiting it now with a more critical eye feels like a fun way to explore both what works and what gets left unexplored. I still have my issues with how Star Rail uses its systems narratively, but that's part of what makes it interesting to dig into. So if this kind of discussion interests you, not just about gacha games, but about fantasy systems and storytelling more broadly, keep an eye out for that one. It might take a bit, but it will be a fun one. If you enjoyed this, feel free to like the video or subscribe, and if you have a gacha magic system you think is interesting or frustrating, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.